So science tells us that the Earth has been in existence for about 4.5 billion years. And for 1 billion years following its creation, the Earth remained in what's called a prebiotic phase, meaning with no life. And for the next 2 billion years, bacteria and other single-celled organisms were the only life forms inhabiting the planet. But these simple organisms established the basic processes of life that enabled the Earth to self-regulate. So that by 1.5 billion years ago, the Earth's surface and atmosphere as we know it today was actually established. And from that point, visible life forms began to appear on the planet, beginning with marine animals, sponges, simple animals like that, then plants, moving on to land, insects, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and so on, increasing in complexity and diversity, even through 5 identified extinction events, and the one most of us know is that of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. So we are now in what has been defined by scientists as a 6th extinction event with unprecedented loss of biodiversity all around the world. The key difference for us is that this one is being caused by the actions of a single species, Homo sapien. And although our first human ancestors evolved here about 2 million years ago, we as Homo sapien have only been here 250 to 400,000 years. And the more recent lineage of Homo sapien, Cro-Magnon, has only been here 35,000 years. That's what they tell us, archaeologists, from cave paintings and things of that nature. So, 3.5 thousand million years of life evolving on Earth, and we've only really been around in our current form for the last 35,000 or so, and we are already changing the balance necessary for life on Earth. So can we turn that around? I don't know, but that is kind of the subject that I want to look at a little bit. And so the title of my talk is Sacred Ecology, and I realized much too late that the title is not on there. Apparently the bar went behind the screen. Don't ask me to explain. But we use the term sacred to identify things we hold to be of greatest value or significance. And the reason I chose Sacred Ecology as the title for this talk is that I believe understanding ecology is a way of understanding that deep interconnectedness that we have with the rest of life. And so there are many cultural and spiritual belief systems and teachings that view the Earth as sacred, and all the species who play a part in that greater coexistence, from the tiniest and most insignificant to the greatest and mightiest, are also sacred because they're integral to the life and well-being of the whole. And this is one example. This is LaDonna Harris. She is a Comanche scholar and activist. And she's talking about the 4 R's of indigeneity. And I would say that what she's saying here is probably reflective of a lot of the wisdom of Native American peoples in general, which is that we are in relationship with all of life, that we bear a responsibility to care for and protect those relationships, that we have to balance what we give and what we take so that we stay in right relationship. And redistribution is about sharing, it's about generosity, about giving of our time, our talents, our material goods, so that everybody gets an equitable opportunity for the gifts of life. And this is Thich Nhat Hanh. He is a Vietnamese Buddhist monk and scholar, and also the founder of something called Engaged Buddhism, which encourages practitioners of Buddhism to engage mindfully in social and environmental issues rather than just detach, which is kind of traditional Buddhism. And I love this, what he's saying here, because it's true. I know for me, and I'm sure for most of us, that we cut reality into compartments, and so we're not always able to see the interdependence of all phenomena here. And to see one and all in one is to break through that great barrier that narrows our perception, our understanding of reality, which Bart and I were talking about a little bit, a barrier that Buddhism calls the attachment to the false view of the self, the separate self, the ego self. So, and Thich Nhat Hanh passed in 2022, but he was extremely influential and still continues to be. And these are just some excerpts of writings from the Upanishads. These are ancient Vedic texts, kind of the precursor to modern Hinduism, and just kind of reflecting the same ideas. Those who understand this see through the world, that there is a unity in all life, that we are at home everywhere and see ourselves in all beings, these kinds of ideas. Here we go. And this guy is Arne Næss. He is a Norwegian philosopher, I should say was, and introduced the idea of deep ecology and the ecological self, that we are actually in and of nature. We are nature expressing as each one of us. And so some of the principles of deep ecology, I won't read the whole screen. All living beings have inherent worth regardless of their utility to human needs. That the natural world is a complex of interdependent relationships between organisms, and that non-vital human interference poses a threat and should be limited. That the living environment as a whole should be respected and have basic moral and legal rights to flourish, and that because survival of any part depends on the whole, we should adopt kind of an ecocentric or ecologically centered view rather than a human-centered view or anthropocentric. And this is kind of an extension of that idea. This was written as a document in Bolivia in 2010 during the Universal Cochabamba Earth Gathering. I don't remember the exact title, but this document was drawn up, and actually some of the things in that became law in Bolivia in 2011, such as the right to exist free from human alteration, the right to clean water and pure air, the right for the earth to have balance and not to be polluted, the right not to have cellular structures modified, genetic modification. So I think that's pretty neat, that they were actually evolved enough to create legislation to protect the earth in Bolivia. I don't know how it's succeeding, but I know that they did pass that. And we call these beliefs pantheistic because they see God as manifest in the universe, God in all things. And this gentleman, Baruch Spinoza, he is about a century and a half after Leonardo da Vinci, but kind of espousing many of the same things, because da Vinci also saw that idea of God in all of nature. And you see by the quote on the bottom, from Einstein, we followers of Spinoza see our God in the wonderful order and lawfulness of all that exists, and as it reveals itself in man and animals. So even Einstein, the scientist, understood that connection between science and sort of the mystical. So I want to talk a little bit about ecology and how that ties in. Ecology is the study of living systems and their environments. And there are three main categories of ecosystems that we use to study ecology, but I'll talk about that in a second. So this studies the relationships between the many different plants and animals and insects and other organisms within an ecosystem, including both the living and non-living elements. So the geology, the precipitation, you know, those are sort of the non-living components, and then all the living species of plants and animals and so on are obviously the living species. And so it looks at that unity within diversity. It's the system science that most clearly illustrates that idea of the interdependence between all living beings, all aspects of creation. Similar to what we see in those spiritual belief systems that I was just looking at. And ecosystems are the basic unit of study in ecology. So you can have a freshwater ecosystem, a marine ecosystem, also terrestrial, which is anything land-based. And so here you just have different examples of ecosystems. A temperate forest, a lake is a whole ecosystem unto itself. A desert, you know, a marine ecosystem, grassland prairie, mountain, and each one will have its own unique species, its own climate, and so on. So for the longest time, we've had this idea of this split between science and religion. And as you can see from this quote from the National Academy of Science, that they occupy two separate realms and they shouldn't really be combined because it takes away from the glory of each. And that is a common belief system. But I say maybe they're just two different ways of viewing and interpreting the same thing, the same reality. So where did this idea of the split between the spiritual and the scientific and between man and nature actually come from? Well, one answer, not the only answer, but this is one. The scientific revolution, this is something that took place in Europe between the 15th and 16th centuries. And these were some of the ideas that became dominant during this period, both in the developing sciences and also in mainstream culture. This idea that nature is a machine, that humans are separate from nature, that human progress arises from the conquest of nature, and that humans are separate from one another, and that the earth is a resource to exploit for human benefit. And the purpose of life is to get wealthy and powerful. So that's a pretty sharp contrast to the earth-centered belief systems that we were just looking at. Instead of a healthy, thriving earth shared by all, wealth in this context is about money and power and private ownership. And that's kind of how our world operates now. So we can find plenty of examples of a cultural mindset of human supremacy over other species in the earth that predate this. But this also takes us into ideas of white supremacy, colonialism, subjugation of other people, particularly by Europeans. And this is an actual journal entry from the Italian explorer Christopher Columbus to King Ferdinand of Spain, whom he worked for. And when he arrived in the Bahamas, his first reaction wasn't like, wow, I want to get to know these people. I want to learn about their culture and try to understand. It was like writing to the king and saying, hey, we can capture them and subjugate them and make them slaves, make them do whatever we want. So very different mindset. And we know where that leads and where that has led in North and South America. Genocide of indigenous people, 12 million Africans enslaved and transported to the Americas. God bless you. So these ideas of separation and supremacy play out in a lot of different ways, and they also play out in the sciences. But this period does offer some pretty clear insights into why our sciences have developed as they have, with this mechanistic view that saw the Earth not as a diverse living intelligence, but basically as a dead rock, a machine comprised of pieces and parts understood mainly in their usefulness to us as human beings. And this form of science is what we call reductionism. And some of the most influential figures in this movement, this was Francis Bacon, an English statesman who lived from 1561 to 1626. And he was also known as the father of empiricism, which is deduction through reason, through the senses and through reason. And you can see from the quotes here, this was kind of the idea of the age, to establish dominion of the human race over the universe, to render ourselves masters and possessors of nature. Sounds a little egotistical to me, maybe? You think? Okay, and some other influential figures during this time period: Thomas Hobbes, English philosopher and writer, René Descartes, French mathematician and scientist, and he was very influential in this movement. And you'll sometimes hear reductionism, aka mechanistic science, referred to as Cartesian science, and it's because of René Descartes' influence on the sciences. And these quotes might sound a little strange, but this actually was the thinking, and some of that thinking still pervades, obviously, our sciences and a lot of other aspects of our society still. So this way of seeing and studying the stuff that makes up our world is called reductionism, because it reduces the study of that stuff to a study of its constituent parts. It doesn't consider the intricate nonlinear relationships and patterns between those parts as we see in systems thinking. So it's analytical. It breaks something down and it examines the parts separately, but it doesn't consider the interrelationships or the context. So it's not contextual. The relationships between the parts and the whole of whatever is being studied. So this does actually create it's useful and it has applications in science, which I won't get into just in the interest of time. But it is limited. It's a limited way of understanding our world. So we see a similar conceptual belief in the separation between God, humans, and the rest of the living world coming out of monotheistic religions. Judaism, Christianity, and the Islamic faith in particular, referred to as Abrahamic here because the sacred texts of all three include references to the figure of Abraham. And all three also portray God as external to this earthly realm. So you're removing that concept of the earth as sacred. And it's interesting to note, if you see on the screen here, polytheism on the left, and also pantheism, as I mentioned, God manifest in the universe. These were the predominant modes of the day for centuries. While these monotheistic religions were being established over this extremely long time period, most people studied or worshipped, in a pantheistic way, or they worshipped many gods. So they were polytheistic. And even, the Apostle Paul was preaching the gospel of Jesus in, the first years of AD. And 300 years later, Emperor Constantine was the first Roman emperor to convert to Christianity and make it the law that people could practice Christianity. So 300 years after Paul was preaching. So this is not a small time span. Monotheistic religions took quite a while to take hold, and now they are fairly dominant in our world. But you still see in Eastern religions polytheism, like Buddhism, Taoism, Hinduism, Confucianism, and others. So, and certainly in Christianity, we see this kind of centering, this elevated status or supremacy of man, and more fundamentalist interpretations of Christianity that, view man as made in God's image, and therefore many interpret that as superior to all other life forms. And this results in what we call anthropocentrism, which is a centering of humans in the order of things. So, in a more ecologically based society, we have the respect for all of creation, that we are part of this larger system. But in our interpretation, we're kind of at the top of the food chain. So, and when we allow this way of thinking to dominate our culture and beliefs, which it still does, of course, as I said, we lose sight of the Earth's intrinsic value and sacredness, and we begin to price and commodify the gifts of nature. So we replace biodiversity with monoculture, as you see on the bottom. And we focus on materialism and making money, to the point now where the wealthiest 26 billionaires in our world own more monetary wealth than half the world's population. And 69 of the top economies in our world are multinational corporations. So I think something's a little out of balance there. Maybe. So, as industrialization continues to expand, we find ourselves increasingly out of balance with the natural systems that support and sustain us, and going beyond planetary boundaries in 6 out of 9 categories for healthy functioning of the Earth's systems. Scientists and other leaders have been begging us for decades now to take this seriously. But there's still a lot of resistance, and there's still a lot of denial, as we know. Former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon on the bottom there, calls it a global suicide pact. Not mincing words. So, what happens if we stay in this trajectory that we're in is that the climate continues to destabilize and shift toward extremes. Rainforests and the incredible diversity of creatures that call them home continue to disappear at a rate that we don't comprehend. Marine life continues to disappear. Coral reefs, which support the numerous species at the base of the ocean food chain, are bleaching and dying from ocean warming and acidification as a result of climate change. Insect populations are collapsing around the world, also depleting the base of terrestrial or land-based food chains, including the pollinators that so many crops depend upon. Wildlife populations have declined throughout the world by 70%. And they all make me crazy, but this one makes me really crazy. More plastic in the ocean by 2050 than fish. And think about this. These profit-maximizing corporations continue to pump out non-recyclable plastics at an ever-increasing rate, and they bear no responsibility or legal obligation to manage these materials or even consider the impact on people or the planet. They have fiduciary duty, and that means that they are beholden to their shareholders and the maximization of profit, and they're not legally required to consider how that profit is made. So 98% of us now have traceable amounts of microplastic in our bodies, and it's in our soils, and it's insanity.
And even in our atherosclerotic plaques.
What he said.
We have found
Yes.
nanoplastics in atherosclerotic plaques.
I believe it. And mother's milk, breast milk, and other, so it's basically microplastics don't break down. That's the issue. Plastic is a polymer, it's a synthetic polymer that doesn't break down. So, okay, I apologize, folks. I am not trying to depress you. But I do think it's important to look at the reality, and I will shift to some of what people are actually doing in the world to affect change. But the impacts on humans of this industrial paradigm, physical and mental health issues, depression, addiction, gun violence, other forms of violence, suicide, anxiety, especially among young people, levels of poverty and suffering caused by a range of issues, but certainly from climate change, desertification, people not being able to grow crops and so on, extremism, authoritarianism, political polarization, we know about that one, increased social fragmentation, and really decreased levels of real communication, because it becomes more and more difficult to have a real conversation when we're so polarized. So, what do we do? Good question, I'm glad you asked. So this leads me to the second half of my talk, A New Story for Humanity. And while I know there's no simple solutions when you're dealing with complex problems, there are ways of thinking about these things that can illuminate a path forward, I believe. And in my book, that starts with this, systems thinking. And I told you I took a course on systems thinking with Fritjof Capra. It was amazing. It was one of the best things I ever did. And so I've become a fangirl of Fritjof Capra, who's like 80-something. A simple definition for systems thinking, which I've referenced already a little bit, is that it's a way of making sense of the complexity of our world by looking at it in terms of wholes, and in terms of the relationships and patterns between parts of the whole, rather than just studying the parts themselves. So there's a couple things I love about this illustration. First, the idea that life does exist as a network, a complex and non-linear system with all these relationships going in different directions. And it shows the concept of holarchy, which I'll talk about a little more, it'll make sense. But if you think of these dots as, say, like individual organisms within an ecosystem or people in a society, Each dot represents something whole and complete unto itself, and yet it's also connected to and part of something greater. And that idea is what's known as emergence, that something is created that couldn't have existed without those unique patterns and relationships between the parts that comprise it. And it's a way of understanding the expression in systems thinking and systems science that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And just to illuminate that further, here's some other ways of thinking of emergence. When people connect, a society emerges. When words connect, language emerges. When neurons connect, consciousness emerges. When organisms connect, an ecosystem emerges. And I thought of another one as a musician. When musicians get together and play their instruments together, music emerges. And it is whole, it is greater than the sum of its parts. So, another really cool illustration of this is the human body, beginning with a simple cell. So, each cell is a whole functioning unit with a semi-permeable membrane. It's separate from the other cells, but the membrane still allows for metabolism of nutrients and energy and interactions with the other cells and their environment. It can't survive in isolation. And within each cell are all these different parts. It is a system. It's got a nucleus and organelles and mitochondria and DNA and RNA and all these cool things. And then it joins with other cells and it forms tissue or other parts of the body. And then those tissues join to form organs or other parts of the body. And those organs join together to form systems, and those systems combine, voila, like your respiratory and your circulatory and your digestive system and so on, to form a person. So I think that's kind of a cool example. But here's the difference between reductionism and systems thinking once again. Reductionism could tell you what the components are that make up the human body, but it wouldn't tell you how those components are organized to function in relationship to one another. And so if you took a pile of body parts and just sewed them together randomly, you would not have a person. You need those patterns and relationships and the context in which they operate to make a functional living system. And this is just kind of another representation of that. If we extrapolate that out further, I know that's a bison, but work with me. We can say that each one of us is like a living cell within the species of humanity, within the system of life comprising the body of our living earth, as this picture kind of illustrates. So it's systems within systems, and that's the idea of holarchy. And this was the idea proposed by NASA climate scientist James Lovelock and biologist Lynn Margulis in their formation of the Gaia hypothesis in the early 70s, also known as Gaia theory because there's so much scientific evidence to support their basic hypothesis, which is that the Earth is a living, intelligent, self-organizing system able to maintain the conditions necessary for life. And I love the quote by Lynn Margulis, that life didn't take over the world by combat, but by networking. You know, so we are not all about competition and, you know, battling for supremacy or, you know, survival of the fittest. We actually, most of evolution can be seen in cooperative endeavors between species. And I also like the one from James Lovelock, evolution is a tightly coupled dance with life and the material world as partners, and from that dance emerges the entity Gaia, Mother Earth. So I'm going to introduce you to some really cool thinkers and heroes of mine, some of whom I've mentioned already, and just share a little bit about how each of them views our story. So the first of these is Joanna Macy. She is amazing. She is a Buddhist scholar and a PhD in systems thinking, an author of like a dozen books or more, a teacher, activist, the founder of this group work modality known as the work that reconnects, and that's, I mentioned I got certified in that. And then you have David Korten, a groundbreaking author and speaker. And his book, Change the Story, Change the Future, is something I'm also going to reference because I think he's brilliant. Then there's Fritjof Capra, the physicist and author who teaches the Capra course, and I highly recommend you all take it. It's an online course and it's wonderful. And Jeremy Lent, another incredible author and speaker and teacher, and he was the teacher of this Principles and Practices of Deep Transformation course that I took a couple of years ago. And Kate Rayworth, she is a groundbreaking economist, and she proposes that we center social and environmental indicators of well-being as a replacement for GDP, for gross domestic product, which our economy runs on, and solely calculates monetary profit. And finally, on the right is Rob Hopkins, who founded the International Transition Movement. And I told you in the introduction, I founded Transition Nashville, and it was all because of that guy. So, beginning with Joanna Macy and the work that reconnects, and a sip of water. There's a lot to the work that reconnects, and I won't have time to go into all of it, but one of the core ideas is that there are these three overlapping stories of our time. And many of us dwell in this first one, business as usual, even when we know better. And in business as usual, we kind of accept the politically correct, corporate controlled media version of our story, where everything's fine, we just continue on our current trajectory, infinite growth on a finite planet, it'll all work out. These things that are happening, climate change, the COVID pandemic, extinction events, and so on, they're just bumps on the road. No need to worry, just trust the people in charge. Now, if you call attention to what's going on in that story, you're called an alarmist. You're called a radical. Sound familiar? I've heard a lot of that as an activist, trust me. The second story is called The Great Unraveling, and that's where we kind of see through that facade of normalcy with greater clarity, and we see some of the imbalances and the exploitation of corporatocracy and the industrial growth paradigm. And some of us, when we confront that reality more clearly, we may feel a sense of hopelessness. There's no point in trying to save ourselves from collapse. And it can bring feelings of anger, it can bring feelings of rage, or, just overwhelm, because it's so much to take in. Again, I know, because I've experienced all those things. Now, the third story is kind of where the work that reconnects tries to focus people, and that's called The Great Turning. And in this narrative of our society, we engage in active hope. We become the agents of change. We don't really know how the story will ultimately unfold from this point, so giving up is not really an option if you want to be hopeful. You play a part in changing those outcomes, because we have this life, this precious gift, and we should use it to the best of our ability to create the kind of world that we want to see and leave for our children. And if we commit to doing whatever we can to move toward a more equitable and harmonious version of what we might become, and away from limited or scarcity-based ways of thinking, it's possible for future generations to actually understand the wealth of a living and thriving earth and a truly equitable society. So, again, there's more to that, but I'm going to move on. And I'm going to talk a little bit about David Korten. The second framing of our social narrative from David Korten, in his book, Change the Story, Change the Future, he lays out how we live by these shared cultural stories and how we've been seduced by a sacred money and market story that is compromising the true wealth of our shared inheritance in the living earth. And he says, in the name of money-seeking corporate robots, which, if you think about the role of AI and algorithms in driving corporate decision-making and behaviors, suddenly that makes a lot of sense. So David suggests that in order to shift this trajectory, we need a new story, a sacred life and living earth story, which is kind of what we've been talking about. And this is a vision, framing vision for a viable future and a living economy. And it parallels The Great Turning from Joanna Macy in a lot of ways. He describes the story as consistent with our nature as beings who have evolved largely through cooperation. And in order to replace the existing story, the false story of sacred money and markets, this story has to accomplish four things. It has to give our lives meaning and purpose. It has to give us a reason to believe that the necessary changes are possible despite powerful opposition. It has to address the false claim that we are by nature individualistic, greedy, and competitive. Somewhat false claim. Sorry. Point the way to a viable human future. So I wanted to read the full description of these two stories, The Sacred Life and Living Earth and Sacred Money and Markets, but I chose instead just to give you a quote again because I want to make sure that I stay in time. Money, it tells us, the Sacred Money and Market story, tells us that money is the measure of all worth and the source of all happiness. The market is omniscient. Earth is just a source of raw materials. Inequality and environmental destruction, unfortunate but unavoidable. Although many recognize this story promotes bad ethics, bad science, and bad economics, it remains our guiding story until we can replace it by a more compelling one that aligns with our deepest understanding of the universe and our relationship to it. So some refer to this shift in our shared story as moving from the Anthropocene, or the human-centered version, to the Symbiocene. So from an inherently destructive system to a life-centered evolving of human consciousness focused on balance and symbiotic or mutually beneficial flourishing of humans and Earth. And you will sometimes hear this current age we're in also called the capital Ocene, where the sacred money and market story reigns supreme in our capitalist global economy. But in either case, it's pretty clear that we need to shift the underlying story and the values that accompany it. So tweaking at the edges is not really enough. So as this, hold on. Ah, yes, okay, sorry, lost my place. So a quick nod to Kate Raworth. I love Kate Raworth. Her book, Donut Economics, which I brought with me, so I could show you guys these books in case you wanted to check them out. She basically proposes, as I said, this alternative economic model that would use environmental and societal well-being indicators in a range of categories as a true measure of economic performance. And that's whether or not the economy actually grows. As opposed to global GDP, which is all about we have to have growth, we have to have growth, we have to have growth. And that only measures monetary gains. Like corporations, it doesn't look at how those gains are made. And so an example is this illustration: a terminal cancer patient, an oil spill, the devastation of a hurricane. Those are actually good for GDP because they're expensive and they cause the expenditure of a lot of money. And so GDP grows as a result of those things. If somebody grows a vegetable garden and stops buying their produce at the market, or if they bicycle to work and stop putting fossil fuel in their car, that's bad for GDP. It's good for the planet, but it's bad for our economic system. So, I want to just give also a very quick reference to Rob Hopkins and the transition movement. We've already been talking about the top there, that we're living in this age of unprecedented change and converging crises. And so the transition movement is comprised of these grassroots community initiatives to build resilience or strength within communities in the face of these interrelated challenges. And what's different about transition is that it is inclusive community engagement, place-based, citizen-led education and action, multi-stakeholder planning to increase local self-reliance and resilience. And again, there's a lot more to that. And I will just mention that Rob Hopkins is a permaculture teacher, and he also not only was the reason for my founding of Transition Nashville in 2010, but the reason that I got my permaculture design certificate in 2012. Because permaculture, as you see like in the middle, it's the use of systems thinking and design principles that provide an organizing framework for implementing a vision of sustainable and regenerative culture. So this is just a way of describing the fact that these things actually are happening in our world. This shift is taking place. You would be amazed. In these courses that I took online, there were people from 30 countries. And when Joanna Macy holds an event, for instance, on the Work That Reconnects website, they do live webinars. And there will be over 2,000 people from all over the world. So this is happening in our world. People are building the new from within the old. So there's lots of ways you can look at that. Transition towns is there, degrowth, this idea that we don't need to keep growing our economy. What we need to do is ensure that there is well-being for the people that are here, that there's equity, and for the health of the planet. So maybe, as Kate Rayworth said, we do need some different kind of indicators for our performance here. And so people are learning all these different deep ecology, agroecology, how to, permaculture, social justice, standing up for LGBTQ rights, racial justice, learning about indigenous ways, and so on. And I knew that it would be a challenge to try to bring all this together. I hope I didn't go too long, but I just wanted to kind of pull these different strands together to give you this sense that we've come to a point in the evolution of our own understanding through system science and other means, earth-centered forms of spirituality, to realize that they actually find common ground with one another. And this is an eco-village in Missouri that I visited, and it's been my kind of dream or idea for a long time to move to an eco-village, so I went to check them out. But Darren and I do our best on our homestead in Bell's Bend. And this is just, I love this quote from Fritjof Capra: ecology and spirituality are fundamentally connected because deep ecological awareness ultimately is spiritual awareness. So that's most of what I had. That's a lot of writing, but I put that up there just as maybe a jumping off point for conversation, and we can talk obviously about any part of this. But these are just some ideas I was assembling about things that we can do. Now this gets more, so some of it could be considered deep ecology, and some of it gets more into the realm of sustainability. What kind of energy do we use? Growing our own food, being a conscious consumer, reducing packaging, driving less, recycling, reducing, divesting from fossil fuels is one I like. I was part of an organization that was trying to get universities to divest from fossil fuels and so on. But anyway, so I will leave you with that, and perhaps I'll just turn it off.
And I'm going to stop filming now. I'm going to stop filming now.
So thank you guys so much. I appreciate
Wow.
it. Yeah.